Are humans naturally good, or are we, inherently flawed? And is the complex society we built, is that the cause of our deepest problems, or is it actually the solution we've been aiming for all along? These are huge questions, right? They're at the heart of so much philosophy, and that's exactly where we're diving today. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are getting into a really revolutionary and honestly, for many people, a pretty unsettling work. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality Among Men. You probably know it as the second discourse. Now, there's a great stack of sources on this. It's dense stuff. Brilliant, though. We've got core bits from the discourse itself, academic analyses, comparisons to thinkers like Hobbes and Locke, and looks at its really long-lasting, often kind of controversial legacy.
Absolutely. And our job here is really to be your guides through all this material. Rousseau's argument, it isn't always straightforward, let's be honest, and his conclusions. They often push against how we tend to think today. So we're going to trace his thinking step by step. We'll start with his attempt to kind of strip away society to find this hypothetical natural man. Then we'll follow the accidental path he thinks humanity took away from that state. And we need to understand his really radical claim about how inequality wasn't just something that happened, but was actively, constructed, formalized. This isn't just history class, though. It's a chance to use Rousseau's critical lens. It's a really powerful one to look at the very foundations of our own social and political world.
Okay, so let's really unpack this first part then. When you open the discourse, what's the big question? What was Rousseau fundamentally trying to achieve with this work?
Well, it's actually remarkably clear right from the title page. He says flat out, he's setting out to investigate, and I'm quoting here, the origin of inequality among men, and is it authorized by natural law? That's his jump-off point. He's looking around at 18th century Europe, seeing these massive gaps, wealth, power, status, privilege, and he's asking how? How did we get here? Did these differences always exist? Are they somehow natural? Or, and this is what he strongly suspects, did they arise historically? From how we've developed and organized ourselves into societies. He's essentially digging for the legitimacy, or maybe the lack of legitimacy, for all this inequality. He wants to expose the foundations, or maybe the lack of solid foundations for it all.
And this idea of natural man or savage man is absolutely central to that, isn't it?
Definitely.
When he talks about this figure, is he describing like actual historical primitive peoples? Is it anthropology?
Yeah. Ah, right. And this is where it gets really interesting, and it's a point that often gets missed or even twisted sometimes. Rousseau's natural man is not meant to be, an empirical description of actual historical groups. Now, sure, his language sometimes borrowed from descriptions of non-Europeans, especially with the whole noble savage idea floating around then. But his figure is explicitly hypothetical. It's a construct, a thought experiment. He himself calls it using conjectures, drawing the most probable conclusions from the nature of things.
So he's not saying, look at this specific tribe.
No, not at all. He's saying, okay, let's imagine stripping away everything we get from society. Think about a human born totally alone, no language, no customs, no education, no social ties, no dependencies. What would that basic core human be like? He's trying to isolate pure human nature before society molds it, shapes it, and in his view, corrupts it. He even admits the specific historical path he sketches out might have happened in various ways, but the method using these conjectures is about understanding where we are now. It's the benchmark, you see, the baseline against which he measures society's effects.
Okay, and why is using this hypothetical construct, this imagined natural man, so vital for his argument about the origin of inequality? Why not just study history?
Because if he can demonstrate that inequality, specifically the moral or political kind, the differences in wealth, status, power, if that's absent in this stripped-down natural state, then bam, he's got a powerful case that this inequality must be a product of society itself. It doesn't come from our fundamental nature. It comes from how we've chosen or maybe been forced to live together. This hypothetical natural man is his baseline, pure nature. He contrasts it sharply with the civil state to show what's been added and what's been lost through social development. It lets him critique society from a viewpoint outside society, highlighting how artificial so many conventions are, including the ones that create inequality.
Right, it gives him that critical distance.
Exactly. Now, some modern anthropologists might push back, saying you can't separate human nature from context, but Rousseau's aim here is philosophical critique, not modern anthropology.
And speaking of pushing back, how does his view of this state of nature stack up against, say, Hobbes or Locke? They also talked about a state of nature, didn't they?
Oh, hugely different. This is one of his biggest breaks with tradition. He's directly challenging them. Hobbes, famously, saw the state of nature as terrifying, a war of all against all.
Yeah.
In Leviathan, Hobbes says life then is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Just constant fear, competition over scarce resources, insatiable desires. The only way out for Hobbes is absolute rule.
And Locke.
Yeah.
A bit less grim, maybe.
A bit, yeah. Locke didn't paint quite such a bleak picture, but he still saw the state of nature as inconvenient. It lacked proper laws, judges, ways to enforce things. So you needed government, mainly to protect natural rights, especially property. Rousseau looks at both Hobbes and Locke and basically says, you guys missed the point entirely. He argues they made a fundamental error. They didn't actually describe natural man. They described civilized man, just without the laws. They kept all the vices and characteristics people pick up in society: greed, vanity, competition, even the fear of death, which Rousseau thinks comes later with reflection.
Ah, so they projected society's problems backwards.
Precisely. They projected the issues of their own time onto this supposed natural state. Rousseau points out, civilized people are always complaining about life, but the savage, or natural man, based on the accounts he had, seems pretty content. He saw their state of nature as reflecting social flaws, not the state before society.
Okay, so if it wasn't this Hobbesian war zone, what was Rousseau's hypothetical natural man like? What were his core drives, his passions?
He boils it down to two fundamental pre-social passions. These exist before reason, before morality. First, there's amour de soi.
Self-love.
Yeah, but more accurately, self-preservation. It's that basic instinctual concern for your own well-being, finding food, shelter, a mate, getting sleep, meeting those core physical needs, avoiding immediate pain, avoiding hunger. And importantly, Rousseau argues natural man doesn't really fear death because that takes foresight, reflection, concepts he hasn't developed yet. It's a passion we share with animals: survival, immediate comfort.
Okay, so amour de soi. What's the second one?
The second one is pitié. Pity or compassion. It's this innate aversion, this repugnance at seeing another sentient being suffer, human or animal. He sees this as a really powerful impulse, totally pre-rational. It's not based on logic or duty, it's a gut reaction. And crucially, he thinks this natural pity acts as a counterbalance to amour de soi.
How so?
Well, self-preservation might make you act purely for yourself, right? But pity tempers that. It makes natural man reluctant to harm others unless absolutely necessary. It's a natural break on aggression, a kind of spontaneous goodwill that exists before any idea of ought or justice.
So those are the basic drives. How they, and maybe other capacities, set humans apart from animals in this state.
Well, amour de soi and pitié definitely have parallels in animals. They preserve themselves. They often react to suffering in their own kind. But humans have something unique, which Rousseau calls perfectibilité.
Perfectibility, like becoming perfect.
Not quite moral perfection, no. It's more like the capacity for self-improvement, for development, for learning, adapting, changing over time, both as individuals and as a species. Animals, they're mostly run by fixed instincts. They don't fundamentally change their nature or invent radically new ways to live. Humans have this plasticity, this potential to develop faculties capable at first of supplying instinct's place and afterwards of raising him much above it. This capacity is what eventually leads us out of that stable, simple state of nature and into, well, the complexity of society. For better, or, as Rousseau mostly sees it, for worse.
And things like language fit in here.
Exactly. Language development is a prime example of perfectibility. Although Rousseau gets really tangled up trying to figure out how language even started. He sees it as so tied to social interaction, he finds it almost impossible to imagine how it could arise before society, or how society could arise without it. It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem for him.
Okay, so if natural man has these simple passions, self-preservation checked by pity and basic needs, why is life then largely peaceful? Why isn't it the conflict Hobbes saw?
Because the conditions for that kind of conflict just aren't there, in Rousseau's view. Needs are simple, easily met from nature. There isn't the kind of scarcity driving desperate competition that Hobbes imagined. Rousseau pictures natural man as scattered, mostly solitary. Nature, he writes, has taken little care to unite mankind by mutual wants. Interactions are minimal, maybe just for mating.
So less interaction means less conflict.
Less opportunity, less reason. Without constant rubbing up against each other, there's little basis for fights over resources or mates beyond maybe a brief encounter. And even then, pity acts as that natural check against unnecessary violence. And crucially, this is where he really departs from Locke. Natural man lacks abstract concepts. No property rights, no justice, no morality, no social status. Rousseau is clear. Men back then, having no moral relations or determinate obligations one with another, could not be either good or bad, virtuous or vicious. They don't get mine versus yours in a way that causes lasting disputes. There's no vanity, no craving for recognition, because there's no society to compare yourself to. Without those abstract ideas, without the complex social passions, conflict over stuff like possessions or status just isn't possible. Life might be physically tough, sure, dealing with nature, but psychologically, morally, it's tranquil.
He even suggests it wasn't miserable.
Yeah, he directly challenges that idea. How can a being with physical freedom and a calm mind be miserable? He contrasts that with civilized man, who, he says, hardly, does not lament his existence. It's a provocative comparison.
It really is.
Okay.
So if this state of nature was relatively benign, maybe even preferable in its simplicity, how did humans ever leave it? What kicked things off? What were the steps towards society, inequality, and, well, corruption?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And Rousseau doesn't see it as some grand design or inevitable progression. For him, it's contingent, accidental, an unforeseen accidental result, as one source puts it. He speculates that maybe external factors were the trigger. Natural disasters, environmental shifts, floods, droughts, harsh winters, maybe volcanic eruptions, things that made the solitary life harder, forcing people closer together just to survive. To tackle common problems, these shared challenges started breaking down that natural isolation.
So necessity brings them together.
Necessity, exactly. And these early forced interactions, that's the thin end of the wedge. Coming together, even just temporarily, leads to developing basic skills, inventing simple tools, maybe cooperating on big hunts they couldn't manage alone. And then the really crucial step, building the first permanent shelters, huts. Because living together, even in small, semi-permanent settlements, leads to families forming, the beginnings of more stable relationships, mutual obligations, and critically, it leads to the first real, sustained social interaction and comparison, seeing the same people day in, day out, noticing who's stronger, who's faster, who's better at hunting, who's built a slightly better hut. This starts to awaken new feelings, pride, shame, envy, the desire for recognition.
And this is where property comes crashing in, is the really pivotal moment.
Oh, absolutely. Permanent shelters, settled life, that's the necessary groundwork for property. If you're constantly moving, owning a specific patch of land doesn't really compute. But once you build a hut, maybe clear a little garden, the idea of this spot being mine starts to make sense. And Rousseau's famous quote just nails it, doesn't it? The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society.
Wow. That's quite a statement.
It is. This act may be initially justified by the labor put in the husbandman's labor alone, gives him a claim also to the land itself. That's the decisive break. It introduces something totally alien to the state of nature, exclusive differential claims to things beyond immediate use.
And how did things like farming and metalworking lock this in? Make it worse, basically.
Well, agriculture obviously requires settling down, cultivating specific plots, protecting harvests over time. That makes the idea and the defense of permanent property absolutely essential and widespread. And metallurgy, working with iron and other metals, needs specialized skills, specialized tools. It leads to new kinds of labor. Rousseau singles out these two arts, agriculture and the art of working metals, as the key drivers that really cemented the division of labor and made permanent, unequal property the norm.
They created interdependence, you mean?
Exactly. The farmer needs the smith's tools. The smith needs the farmer's food. But this interdependence, it comes with a major downside. It locks in unequal outcomes because people have different talents, different levels of effort, different circumstances, maybe just different luck. As Rousseau puts it, the strongest did most work. The most skillful turned his labor to best account. The most ingenious devised methods of diminishing his labor. These natural physical differences, which barely mattered in isolation, now translate directly into having more or less stuff. This is where, he says, natural inequality unfolds itself insensibly with that of combination. Physical differences become socially significant, creating visible, lasting, and often resented differences in fortune.
Okay, so property is established. It's being reinforced by farming and metalworking. The picture is shifting dramatically. And this leads us right to Rousseau's really crucial distinction between different kinds of inequality, doesn't it? Natural versus moral.
Precisely. This distinction is absolutely fundamental to his whole critique. He readily admits there is a natural form of inequality, natural or physical inequality. That's just the differences we're born with or develop physically: age, health, strength, speed, intelligence, dexterity. These exist in the state of nature for sure, but like we said, they don't really matter much there because people are independent. A stronger person doesn't really have the means or motive to dominate a weaker one consistently.
Okay, so that's natural inequality. What's the other kind?
The other kind, the one he's really gunning for, is moral or political inequality. This type, he insists, is purely a product of society. It's established by convention, by habit, by the consent of men, though maybe not truly informed consent, as we'll see. This includes all the differences in wealth, social standing, honor, privilege, and, critically, the power some people have to make others obey them. He's emphatic. This moral or political inequality has no counterpart or basis in natural physical inequality. It's something humans construct through interaction and agreement, or disagreement disguised as agreement.
And he's adamant that this moral kind only exists because of society. It's not there at all in the state of nature.
Not in any meaningful way, no. It arises directly from those social interactions that start snowballing once people settle down. Living together, interacting constantly, people inevitably start comparing themselves. They look at what others have, how they look, their skills, their talents, who they know. This constant comparison, that's the engine that creates social status, the desire for esteem, for recognition. As one analysis puts it, moving from isolation to living together just fundamentally rewires the human psyche.
Which brings us to that other key term, amour propre. How does that sit in? How is it different from the simple amour de soi, the self-preservation thing?
Oh, this is maybe the most critical psychological concept in the whole discourse. This is where Rousseau's critique of society really bites. Amour de soi is that natural, basic self-love focused on survival and well-being. It's innate, simple. Amour propre, though, is social self-love. It only exists in society when we start comparing ourselves to others. It's driven by the desire for recognition, for esteem, for feeling superior. It's not just about being okay yourself. It's about wanting others to see you as okay, maybe even better than them.
So it's inherently comparative.
Deeply comparative. And that's where the trouble starts. It's the root of competition, jealousy, vanity, shame, pride. It makes us live based on how we think others see us. It creates this split, this need to be and to seem. We start putting up a front, a facade that might not match how we really feel. Rousseau puts it powerfully. To be and to seem became two totally different things. And from this distinction sprang insolent pomp and cheating trickery with all the numerous vices. This shift from natural, simple self-love, amour de soi, to this social, comparative, often anxious or aggressive kind, amour propre. That's the psychological engine of societal corruption for Rousseau. It's why natural pity declines, because amour propre makes us prioritize our own social standing over someone else's suffering.
Wow. So even before we get to formal government, we've got this pretty miserable state emerging, right? Property comparison, amour propre, competition, vice. What happens next? This sounds unstable.
Deeply unstable. This situation, fueled by insecure property claims and inflamed amour propre, inevitably leads to conflict. It creates a state of war. But remember, this is crucial. This is not the original state of nature. This is a social state of war, driven by greed, competition, conflicting interests that only arise after property and social comparison take hold. And the rich, the ones who've managed to grab property, maybe Rousseau hints, through precarious and false titles. Since there were no rules, yet they feel particularly vulnerable. They know their stuff is maintained only through force.
And this chaos, this vulnerability, is what leads to the idea of a social contract, but not in a good way, according to Rousseau.
Not in a good way at all. Precisely. Rousseau's account of the first political society, the original social contract that forms the state, is devastating. He doesn't see it as some enlightened agreement for the common good. He paints it as a fundamentally dishonest trick pulled off by the rich. The rich man, seeing his wealth constantly threatened in this social war, cooks up a plan. Rousseau calls it the profoundest plan that ever entered the mind of man. A clever scheme.
Okay, what was this profound but deceitful plan?
The rich man goes to the poor, the less fortunate, and proposes setting up institutions of justice, laws, government. He plays on their desire for peace, for security. He says basically, hey, let's join forces, let's create rules to protect everyone, to guard the weak from oppression, to restrain the ambitious, and secure to every man the possession of what belongs to him. Let's have rules of justice and peace that everyone, rich and poor alike, has to follow. It sounds fair, right? Rational. A system to end the fighting and protect everybody's property and rights.
But the deception is in the motive and the result.
Exactly. The motive is pure self-interest for the rich man. Legitimize and protect the property he already has. Property may be gained unfairly by enshrining it in law. And the poor, suffering from the violence, maybe lacking foresight, Rousseau implies they're still a bit like natural man, not thinking too far ahead. They are, in his words, simple enough to believe him. In Shirley, they sign on, thinking they're getting universal justice and protection for their own few belongings. But what they're really doing is agreeing to a system that formalizes and locks in the existing inequalities of property and power that benefit the rich. As the sources make clear, this is explicitly an illegitimate social contract. It's not offered as a normative ideal, but just the opposite. It's a deceitful proposal using plausible arguments to swap the messy rule of force for the seemingly neutral rule of law, but a law designed to keep the existing hierarchy in place.
So this first contract doesn't fix inequality. It basically puts a legal stamp on it, entrenches it.
That's exactly Rousseau's radical point. This initial move into political society doesn't solve the problem. It gives it a legal and political structure. It takes those differences in wealth and power that arose kind of haphazardly and maybe unfairly before, and gives them the full backing of the state. It sets up rules that primarily protect the advantages of those who are already ahead, effectively locking the poor into their disadvantaged position. Modern critics like Mills or Pateman really pick up on this idea of an illegitimate contract to critique how things like race or gender inequality get embedded right into society's foundations.
Right, arguing the contract wasn't really between equals.
Precisely. For Rousseau, this first step into formal society based on this fraud is the birth of political inequality, built right on top of economic inequality.
Okay, so if that first flawed contract locks in inequality between rich and poor, where does it go from there? Rousseau sees it getting worse.
Okay.
He traces further stages.
Oh yes, he outlines a grim progression. It doesn't stop there. He sees inequality deepening through three main stages, each building on the previous one, pushing things to a greater extreme, all built on that shaky, illegitimate foundation. Stage one is what we just discussed, the establishment of law and the right of property. This formally authorizes the distinction between rich and poor. That's the first big division, now legally recognized.
Okay, rich and poor. What's stage two?
Stage two is the institution of magistracy. This means creating government offices, political roles, appointing rulers, magistrates, judges, leaders. This introduces a new division between the powerful and weak. People who hold these positions of authority gain power over those who don't. Now, Rousseau suggests these roles might have initially been presented as elective, maybe based on merit or age. But the competition for power inevitably led to intrigue, factions, even civil conflict, and the result of that instability. Ironically, it often led to these positions becoming hereditary, concentrating power even further in fewer hands.
So from rich-poor, we get powerful-weak. What's the third and final stage?
The third and final stage is the slide from legitimate power into arbitrary power. This is the descent into pure despotism, into tyranny. It happens when those hereditary rulers start treating their public offices, even the state itself, as their own private property. They stop seeing citizens as members of a political community and start viewing them basically as possessions, like livestock. Rousseau uses strong language here, describing these despots seeing themselves as equals of the gods and kings of kings. This horrible endpoint creates the ultimate distinction between master and slave.
Rich or poor, then powerful-weak, and finally master-slave. That's the trajectory.
That's the trajectory, yes, the last degree of inequality. At this point, the government has totally broken down. The despot isn't bound by any law, not by the people's will, only by his own whims, his passions. The subjects, they're stripped bare, no rights, no property, no effective will. They have, as Rousseau puts it, no law but the will of their master. All ideas of justice, fairness, they just evaporate under this arbitrary rule.
And then, in this really startling twist, Rousseau says this state of total tyranny actually brings things full circle. It's like a return to the state of nature.
It's a complex and, startling point. But yes, he argues this is the last degree of inequality, the extreme point that closes the circle and meets that from which we set out. He explicitly calls it a new state of nature. But, and this is crucial, he immediately says it's tragically different from the original state. He contrasts them sharply. The one was a state of nature in its first purity, while this is the consequence of excessive corruption.
So it's a corrupted reflex.
Exactly. In this tyrannical state, the social contract, any semblance of it, is completely gone. The government has zero legitimacy. All that's left is raw force. The law of the strongest reigns supreme again. But unlike the original state of nature, where strength differences didn't matter much because of isolation and pity, here force dictates everything. The despot rules by force. The people obey only because they have to, because of force. And if the despot gets overthrown by force, a rebellion, A coup Rousseau almost shrugs, saying that's just the law of the strongest reasserting itself. Everything takes place according to the natural order, he writes, but it's a dark, twisted version of that order, where force, not need or pity, is the only rule. Everyone becomes equal again, but only in the sense that they are equally nothing before the despot, or equally vulnerable to whoever is strongest.
That is just an incredibly bleak assessment of how societies develop. Looking back at the whole argument, what are the most radical, maybe the most controversial, parts of Rousseau's critique of civilization in this discourse?
Well, the sheer pessimism is radical in itself, especially for the Enlightenment era he was writing in. This idea that progress in arts, sciences, industry doesn't actually improve humanity but corrupts us, that it leads to misery, not happiness. That was fighting words for many Enlightenment thinkers. He actively questions the value of vain sciences and sees luxury not as a sign of success, but as a profound evil that weakens people and states. The claim that sophisticated, supposedly superior, civilized man is actually more miserable, more vicious, more alienated than the simple savage, that was deeply countercultural.
Offensive.
Even that comparison between the complaining civilized person and the content savage is pretty stark. It is. And then there's his whole origin story for political institutions, arguing that property, law, government didn't arise from some noble, rational consensus for the common good, but from a trick by the rich to protect their unfair advantages. That's a fundamental attack on traditional political philosophy, including thinkers like Locke, who tried to justify property and government. He's essentially saying the very foundation of civil society is rotten, built on deceit and locking in inequality, not on genuine agreement for freedom. And his view that arts and sciences often corrupt morals, making people vain and focused on appearances, echoing critics like Socrates or Cato that challenge the core Enlightenment belief in reason and knowledge as inherently virtuous forces.
Given how provocative and critical it is, what kind of impact did the discourse have? How did it influence later thinking or historical events?
Oh, the influence is enormous, really widespread. Philosophically, culturally, it's seen as a key text feeding into Romanticism. The whole romantic emphasis on nature, emotion, individual feeling, the critique of artificial modern life that finds a lot of resonance in Rousseau's picture of a pure natural state and his critique of society's corruption. The whole noble savage idea, even if it simplifies Rousseau, became a powerful trope in Romanticism. Politically, it was dynamite. The discourse, along with his later social contract, became major intellectual fuel for revolutionary movements, especially the French Revolution. His critique of the existing power structures, the idea that inequality was artificial and fraudulent, his arguments about popular sovereignty, these gave theoretical ammunition to those challenging the monarchy and the aristocracy. Some analyses even call the social contract a theoretical weapon for the revolutionaries, comparing its impact then to Marx's manifesto later on.
And its relevance continues today.
Absolutely. His analysis of how property, social comparison, amour propre, and the hunger for status drive inequality, alienation, even psychological distress, that speaks directly to modern concerns about economic gaps, social divisions, consumerism, the pressures of social media with its constant comparison culture. It's all there. And as we mentioned, thinkers today still build on his ideas about illegitimate contracts to analyze how systemic inequalities based on race, gender, or class get embedded in the very structure of society.
So what are the big lingering questions the discourse leaves us grappling with today? Does he think humanity is just doomed by society? Is there any way out of this cycle of inequality and potential tyranny he describes?
He definitely paints a sobering picture, doesn't he? And yeah, the discourse leaves us with some deeply uncomfortable questions. It really forces you to look critically at the societies we live in. Are our institutions genuinely working for everyone's well-being? Or are they, maybe without us even realizing it, or maybe deliberately, perpetuating inequalities that have these flawed historical roots? Has our relentless drive for progress, for stuff, for status, cut us off from something more fundamental, contentment maybe, or natural empathy? Are the huge inequalities we see just inevitable? Or are they, as Rousseau insists, artificial creations that we actually have the power, however hard it might be, to challenge or change?
The tension is palpable.
It really is. That tension between the obvious benefits of organized society, safety, convenience, knowledge, and the costs. Lost freedom, inequality, the psychological weight of comparison, the ever-present risk of tyranny. Rousseau believed that by tracing this slow succession from nature to society, we could find the solution of a number of problems of politics and morals. He challenges us to wonder if, in our race towards civilization, we've lost something vital about ourselves. That quote about Diogenes looking for an honest man. Maybe Diogenes couldn't find one because he was seeking among his contemporaries a man of an earlier period. It makes you ask if true human flourishing may be possible in a simpler, more equal state is something we've lost forever, or something we could still somehow strive for.
Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequality is definitely not light reading. It's powerful, it's unsettling, and it really shakes up basic assumptions about who we are and the societies we've built. It is a deep dive that gives you so much to chew on. Whether you ultimately buy his whole story about the fall from nature, or his level of pessimism, his way of analyzing the links between human nature, society, and how inequality arises and gets locked in, that's still revolutionary and incredibly relevant for understanding power and privilege today. So, after walking through Rousseau's journey from that pure state of nature through property and a more proper, the fraudulent contract, and the slide towards tyranny, maybe consider this. In our own complex modern world, how much of the inequality you see around you, the inequality you experience, is really natural or unavoidable? And how much might be, as Rousseau suggested, the unforeseen or maybe the intended result of the very way we've decided to live together?